Hi folks, my name is Franco Tanelli and today I'm going to talk about interpretation in classical music. But first, as all Greek philosophers used to do before starting a discussion, let's define as clearly as we can what is interpretation. Who is the interpreter? First of all, we know that in English language, interpreter is a person who translates a live speech into other languages. Interpreter in music, we call the person who translates what is written in a score or in a paper into a live music. We know that the old notations were quite vague. In some, there were only directions showing where you should go and not some concrete notes. Composers and authors back then were like modern jazz musicians. They would give an idea of what they compose, but then give a great freedom to interpreter. Among musicians, singers were considered to be the best musicians, and not because they were arguably considered to be the best instruments of all. They were the most prepared instruments of all because they knew all the components of compositions like contrapoint. They could improvise, they could analyze the music, and they used to play at least one accompanying instruments like guitar or clavichord. Now we understand why they had such a respect from conductors and composers. That respect was earned by qualifications they had. By the mid of the 19th century, power of the singers were absolute. Some popular singers of that time could on the spot fire a conductor or even a director of the opera house. They were the centers of the musical universe and they never wanted to change that willingly. The art of belcanto was on its peak, but the drama in opera was declining. In fact, drama in opera did not exist anymore. Singers back then were not just allowed to sing any encores they wanted, but for the public they could pull out any aria from any another known composer. Tastes of the public and, accordingly, interpreters were degrading too. Speaking how power can corrupt. Giuseppe Verdi, an Italian composer who were opposed by these practices, tried to turn the tables on that. Psychologically speaking, all 19th century composers used to have a complex of inferiority towards all the musicians or singers. Singers, on the other hand, developed a complex of superiority. They did not suspect that the 20th century was the time for revolutions, not only in political systems, but in music itself. Nobody suspected a modest cellist to become one of the most fearsome musical dictators of all times. When Toscanini was still playing as a cellist in the orchestra, he had enough of the self-indulgent singers who everybody envied. Toscanini, not only as a musician, but also as a political person, never liked freedom. His fame as one of the best opera conductors ever existed on earth came from political reasons. He was one of the few who had guts to oppose the fascist regime of Mussolini, to oppose a political dictatorship with musical dictatorship. That might surprise some, but after Toscanini's opposition to Mussolini's regime, the Western press made him the best conductor in the world, hid the fact that he was a very active member of the fascist party, actually competing with Mussolini for power. Many say that Toscanini actually brought a necessary balance that was broken in the 19th century by self-indulgent belcanto singers. I agree that some great changes in opera were absolutely necessary, but many think, and I agree with that thought, that Toscanini actually killed freedom of interpretation. Singers' interpretations were considered to be self-indulgent, and such interpretational indication as fermata and col canto were considered not to be fermatas and col cantos of the interpreter, but of a conductor. I remember that political and even musical brainwashing at my time about Toscanini was like that. Well, Toscanini is the greatest conductor ever existed on this planet, and nobody can argue with that, period. Brainwashing was so strong that even I accepted this idea without really checking out who was really Toscanini. And when I checked it out, I had a great disappointment. When I listened to my favorite conductors like Furtwängler or Herbert von Karajan, honestly, I have goosebumps. When I hear Toscanini, and this is my personal opinion, I hear playing machine. So Toscanini absolutely disregarded the personal freedom of an interpreter, of his singer, and proposed only his own way of doing it. Or, in other words, to play what's in the score. What's in the score is the real intention of the composer. Why I'm paying such a huge attention to 19th century belcanto, self-indulgent singers, and dictatorship of Maestro Toscanini? In spite of the charisma, great memory, and ear, Maestro Toscanini, to my point, had two-dimensional understanding of the tempo. Tempo for him was metronomic, since he considered metronomic tempo as the tempo of the universe. In this interpretation, one can hardly call an interpretation, you can hear the metronomic tempo. In the next recording, you will hear the same piece interpreted with tempo rubato. Musicians' misunderstanding of the tempo comes from human misunderstanding of the time. I would say the time is considered to be as a ticking clock, and the time is not a ticking clock. The true time is a process, and a process very subjective. We know that from our own experiences. If we are very attentive to our state of mind while we are playing the piece, only then we can have the true connection with the music and with the author. Great Russian writer Gogol once said that the written word is a lie already. Another great, but this time a composer, Richard Strauss, used to say that the notes are not the most beautiful part of the music. How can we make any sense of other expressions saying that everything is a score, you don't have to invent anything? These are contradictory statements, of course, and I think the answer is very simple. If you have a talent to understand and read the score, and which is not as simple as you probably thought, then you have the right to be an interpreter. Any style in music has stylistic limitations. An interpreter's task is to find his own freedom in these limitations. Otherwise, well-programmed computer will play much better than this interpreter. Remember that the most of the today's interpreters actually are not interpreters of their own ideas and own emotions. They are interpreters of their coaches, especially in vocal music. The trust for us singers as musicians is so low today that another musician might ask you, "Wow, what a beautiful interpretation. Who coached you?" In fact, true interpretation cannot be coached. True interpretation is like your soul in the total unity of the soul of the composer in one beautiful dance. And one way to achieve it is not to understand the score mechanically as most of us do, but creatively, through our own emotions and ideas. That is not possible if you don't know the music you're playing or singing from inside out, its traditions. It could be necessarily not mental, but it could be intuitive. Only that attitude can bring true art to us. Now let's look at the phrase from "Ho cessate di piegarmi" and compare one more free interpretation to mechanical one, and I'd like you to decide yourself which one is a mechanical and which one is the interpretation.
Ho cessate di piegarmi, ho lasciatemi morire, ho lasciatemi morire.
And another one.
Ho cessate di piegarmi, ho lasciatemi morire, ho lasciatemi morire.
Remember that tempo rubato is a very difficult thing to do because it's a free, absolutely free relationship with the rhythm and with the tempo. there are basically two types of rubato. The first rubato is when the tempo is flowing. It's not two-dimensional, it's not metronomic, but it's flowing. Second type of rubato is when the accompaniment is almost metronomic and the melody is free. It's much freer than it is written in the score. That type of rubato is quite known to jazz musicians as swing. Though this C-Jam blues played the way it is written, any jazz musician will tell you that it's terrible because there is no sense of jazz music in this particular interpretation. Now you're talking. There's a sense of swing. If anybody tries to write exact score of how people swing, it would be very difficult to read because there will be 1/28 and the triples and sixtuples and whatever. Great composers and musicians know perfectly that no matter how in detail you write the score, the music is not guaranteed to be lifeless if you don't let interpreter to put his own soul into it. This is a second type of rubato when the orchestra accompanying side or the left hand is very rhythmical and the right hand it takes some liberties. So, if you want to be a real interpreter, first thing you have to do is to learn the style you're playing and of course to learn the freedom in this particular style. And you're smart if you're learning the style from a singer and not the instrumentalist. Great Russian composer Glinka argues against taking lessons from instrumentalists. Remember that instrumentalists were always learning from singers. There's a very famous expression if you go to the great coaching lessons of the violin player, or they would suggest, you have to play like you're singing it. To my opinion, instrumentalists brought a great damage to vocal music. It doesn't mean we don't need them. It doesn't mean we don't need a good coach, a pianist who will suggest and correct our intonation, remind us about the rhythmical things that we didn't do right. This is all stays in force. And of course I'm not saying that all singers of the past were so great and today's singers are so bad. There would be an old guy, complaining about the modern state of art. It's not that. But what I want to say, if you compare old singers with today's singers, there is a significant difference. Today's singers are very well coached, and I repeat, very well coached. But I don't hear personalities like I used to. If you compare the singers of the 20th century, you might like them, you might not, but you hear a very distinct personality. Caruso is different from Gili, and Pertile is totally different, And today, because of this coaching system, totally disrespecting the freedom of the singer, brought us to the state we are today. Maybe we are to blame too, because most of us lost this personality. Great American soprano and friend of mine, Phyllis Curtin, Recently, I guess 1 or 2 years ago, she published an interesting interview in Times magazine, and I have to mention that Madame Phyllis Kerting, she was a great singer, and she's a part of a great establishment. She used to be one of the leading coaches in Tanglewood Festival and Tanglewood School, and she's very well respected. And yet she complained that today's singer's freedom is totally disregarded and not taken into consideration, and that's why today's vocal music becomes well done but boring, honestly. That was Franco Tanelli. That's it for today. Until next time.